Welcome to our webinar panel. For anybody that's joined us in the last couple of minutes, I'm Laura. I work at Nature and Culture International, and I will be your moderator for the evening. I want to welcome all of you to this webinar entitled Climate Summit, Forests, Wildlife, and Us. I'm thrilled to be your moderator for tonight's discussion. We're really excited because we've brought together a very exciting panel of experts for you today. Although the majority of our speakers are joining us from different backgrounds and organizations, a few of our panelists are involved in some capacity with Nature and Culture International. We are a nonprofit conservation organization working to protect areas throughout some of the most biodiverse places in Latin America. With us tonight, we have our Executive Director, Matt Clark, as well as our newest board member, Bob Keefe, joining the conversation as well. We are currently in the middle of our end-of-year fundraising campaign, which is named Save Our Forests, Secure Our Climate. So if you are compelled by anything that you hear today or this evening, please consider donating to our campaign to mitigate deforestation in the Andes and Amazon. So a little housekeeping before we dive in. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what we have in store. We're going to start by understanding the vital link between climate change and forests, which is at the core of our conversation today. Next, we have a distinguished panel of experts who will share their insights and experiences on how climate change affects their various fields of work and research. Our experts will give a brief intro into their field, including the topic of forests, biodiversity, and climate policy. We're going to pause for questions following each topic area because we want this webinar to feel more like a discussion than a lecture. But we will also leave a longer bit of time for Q&A at the end of the webinar as well. If you have any questions, please submit them throughout the evening using the Q&A function. Please don't use the chat for submitting questions. You should see the Q&A in that bar on your Zoom webinar. Feel free to chat in the chat. We want this to be as interactive as possible, but we will be selecting questions from the Q&A function. We've also enabled closed captioning, and the webinar will be recorded and a link will be shared after the event. Lastly, if you experience any technical issues, you can reach out to our support team in the chat for assistance. Again, feel free to use the chat, but if you have a question, please send it in through the Q&A form. Quickly, I want to share the results of the poll that we had earlier, just so everybody can see what their fellow attendees, what came to mind for them when they think about climate. One second. Here we go. So here are the results of the poll that we shared at the beginning of the webinar. Quite an array of answers, lots of different words here that come to mind for your fellow attendees when they're thinking about climate. All right, we're going to get back to the webinar. So to help us navigate this complex topic, we have brought together a group of esteemed researchers and partners who are going to share their knowledge and experience with us today. These 5 are experts in their respective fields and collectively bring a wealth of experience in forest conservation, climate science, and environmental policy. We're really excited and thankful that all of you have joined us today. Our first topic is forests. Forests play a vital role in sequestering carbon, helping to regulate our climate and global temperatures. But as we all know, the impacts of climate change, as well as human activities like mining and logging, are putting immense pressure on forest ecosystems. I would like to introduce our illustrious first panelist, Matt Clark, the Executive Director of Nature and Culture International, to speak about tropical deforestation and the effects on climate change. Matt, please share a little bit about your work at NCI, and then please also share what gives you hope.
Thank you, Laura. So I would flip it around and say not how does climate change affect our work, but how our work affects climate change. The core of what nature and culture does is to conserve landscapes, ecosystems that are not only incredibly biodiverse, harbor a massive amount of biodiversity, but also sequester and store massive amounts of carbon. And that's the carbon that we keep from entering the atmosphere as pollution. So when I say ecosystems, I mean primarily forest ecosystems, but we also do work in the high elevation Paramo ecosystems, which have a lot of organic soils, which store a lot of carbon, peat swamps. So not just forest ecosystems, but others as well. And to illustrate this, take the Amazon rainforest, which has, by some estimates, up to 400 billion trees, which, if convert that into tons of carbon, is almost 140 billion tons of carbon. If those trees are cut and burned and the carbon enters the atmosphere as carbon pollution, that's the equivalent of the annual exhaust of almost 30 billion cars. So to achieve the goals of the Paris Accord to keep our ceiling, our temperature increase at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to keep those trees standing. Next slide, please. So the Amazon basin is obviously famous for its rivers, but lesser well known, there's actually a massive amount of atmospheric water in quote unquote flying rivers above the Amazon basin. The pulses of daily evapotranspiration from those 400 billion trees that I mentioned, those drive cloud convection and rainfall patterns around the globe. And I'm going to demonstrate, this is actually a very cool illustration of this. If you notice over the Amazon and the Congo and those massive rainforests, you can see those are the daily pulses of evapotranspiration. And notice how the wisps of clouds and hence rain are going up into Europe. They're going down to Tierra del Fuego. They're going up into Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, the southern United States. So we are not sure how much additional deforestation the Amazon could tolerate as a system before this massive water vapor pump that is driving global rainfall patterns, how much more deforestation the system could tolerate before it stops functioning in the way it's functioning now. And I would argue that we don't want to find out what happens in case it's bad, which it quite well could be. So what am I hopeful about? I thought a lot about this question. What I am going to highlight is that earlier this year, working with our indigenous and government partners in Morona, Santiago, we were able to declare the Tarimia Puhutai Nunca protected area. That is a name that is a Shuar phrase that means the place where the Shuar live authentically in plenty and harmony. This is a more than 3 million acre protected reserve. And it was created by a group of stakeholders, including nature and culture, but indigenous nationalities and provincial and municipal governments that traditionally haven't worked together. The reserve was actually delimited and is zoned according to Shuar and Achuar, which is another indigenous group there, according to their cosmovision and traditional management principles. So I think this is really exciting. This is actually the third provincial protected area in the Ecuadorian Amazon, where NCI has led a diverse group of partners to come together to put land in protection and then to collaboratively develop a management plan. So it's a highly effective model. It's a highly replicable model. And we are in the process of moving north into the 3 remaining provinces in the northern Ecuadorian Amazon to achieve the exact same thing. And we are going to add several million more acres into conservation. So that's something that I'm very, very hopeful about, is just the way that these diverse stakeholders are coming together to work collaboratively. So with that, I'll stop my yapping and I'll turn it over to, I am going to share that Chris, who's going next, is an old friend of mine. And actually we played in a rock band together. So we're now sharing the stage. That was in our salad days when we were young and green in judgment, but we're now older and more mature. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris. And I expect very mature things from you, Chris.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for sharing what gives you hope. And hopefully, if we can stop tropical deforestation, young men can play in rock bands together in plenitude forever, in perpetuity. But yes, thank you, Matt, for sharing some of our very vital and important work that we do at Nature and Culture International and how deforestation and climate play into that. As Matt mentioned, our next panelist is his esteemed former bandmate, Chris Oishi. Chris is going to share some of his experiences working with the U.S. Forest Service. Chris, would you mind giving us a brief introduction to your work and how it intersects with climate change and what gives you hope?
Yeah, so thanks so much. It's great to be involved in this panel. And if in case people are wondering if I'm just here because I know Matt or whatever this is, or what someone from the U.S. Forest Service doing here, well, hopefully I can explain that. So if you go to the next slide, I am a research ecologist with the Forest Service, and we're part of the United States Department of Agriculture. And part of our mission really is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands. So this is really embedded in our mission. And I'm within the research and development side of things. So we're not working on management specifically, but what we're really our goal is to provide the best science available to help the agency make the best management decisions that they can. And so I'm a scientist. I work with university partners as well as NGOs and other federal agencies. And our goals within the research and development side are to generate the science, findings, and tools that assist land managers to sustain our nation's forests and grasslands. And that means land managers not only at the federal level, but also state and private landowners. So basically providing the science that's available to them. And, part of what we're looking at too is not just to provide it for the United States, but to deliver this knowledge worldwide. Providing both applied helping to answer applied questions when they're asked from partners, as well as providing sort of basic science that can help us to understand how critical ecosystem processes might affect feedbacks with the climate. And so one of our stated priorities is to examine climate change, and this includes adaptation and resilience strategies, nature-based climate solutions, which forestry and forest management is a key part of, and forest carbon management. This is embedded in our mission statement and our objectives. And this is really at the cornerstone of my work. And I will say too, this is my disclaimer that I'm not speaking as the mouthpiece for the United States government or USDA. I'm speaking as my role here as a scientist, and this is a scientific perspective. So I'm really the things about policy questions are a little outside of the scope of what I can address. But I can talk to you from the scientific perspective here. And the figure on the right shows two things. One, it shows in the dark green on the top federal forested lands from the National Forest System, and then the lighter yellow is forested lands in the United States. And this is mapped on top of, you can see the rivers that are the rivers and drainages throughout the United States. And the lower graph, we've also added on water yield that's coming from these different areas. And you can see that there's a lot of overlap. Where there are forests, there's also a lot of water coming out of those forests that feeds groundwater supplies and feeds surface water supplies. So the links between water supply and forest is one of the critical parts of really the Forest Service's mission and our mission within our specific office. So next slide. And so my work really gets into looking at the soil plant atmosphere continuum, and I'm really interested in trees. So it really involves these feedbacks between the climate and the biosphere. And the trees that I'm interested in, really, because the plants have this awesome ability to basically convert sunlight energy and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into carbohydrates, which they can then turn into wood products. They can turn into trees, into biomass, into food. And they can also sequester a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, or from the atmosphere in the ground. So this is critical in climate change, as everyone's aware. And like I mentioned before, plants also play a critical role in the water resources because photosynthesis requires plants to take water up out of the soil and bring them up to the leaves that are up in the canopy. And so this water movement, which is called transpiration, it really puts plants there. There's an amazing hydrologic engineers that have to balance the amount of water supply that they have through this water column tension that goes up to the plant leaves without basically having too much tension. If they lose the ability to do that, then it can cause death. And this is one of the key factors in how climate change is really affecting forests. And so when water supply is high and atmospheric conditions are mild, and sort of kind of ideal growing season situation, plants can readily achieve this balance in the soil water between the soil water supply and the atmospheric demand for water. However, when the water becomes stressed, either at the soil level or in the atmosphere, that's when the plants can either basically have to close their stomata to regulate their water loss, and they have the risk of overheating, or they basically lose that water column tension. The straw that moves water from the soil up to the atmosphere breaks, and they basically have no more supply of water to their plants. And so this is it, like Matt mentioned, this process of moving water up to the plants, moving water from the soil up into the atmosphere is a critical element in determining local and regional weather patterns. It's also a major component of the Earth's energy budget. So out of all the energy, the sun's energy that reaches the soil surface, reaches the Earth's surface, some of that can be is driving the transpiration. It's basically causing the Earth to sweat, pulling water up into the atmosphere. The energy that isn't used for that increases the surface temperature. So we're in this balance. So in cases where forests are there, when forests are active and are actively transpiring, they can help to create cooler climate conditions locally. So how does climate change factor back into this? You can go to the next. Oh, and I guess ultimately what I've shown these two figures for too is that different plants have different strategies. They have different adaptations locally, and they can respond. So not all plants will respond to global changes in the same way. And so what we have is that some of the key factors that are driving global change are this increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so this has a direct effect on plants, even outside of the temperature effect, because since plants are taking up CO2 to perform photosynthesis, increasing CO2 can partially fertilize them. It's basically they can kind of getting more CO2, allowing that to diffuse into their leaves. It can help to offset some of the increasing carbon dioxide through additional sequestration, but really in some cases just a little bit, and that is not basically enough to sustain the increasing rate of CO2. In addition to that, we have global temperatures increasing. These are predictions from the IPCC, and we're seeing that global temperatures are increasing really around the world, and some of the predictions increase drastic rates. And so hotter temperatures, like I mentioned, they can drive both, some of the things that warmer temperatures can do is they can increase a lot of the metabolism in plants. So basically, some plants might grow faster, but it also may cause some plants to reach a level of heat stress where it is going to cause detrimental effects on them. And it's also leading to basically a higher demand for water. Basically, these higher temperatures can pull more water out of the system, which is going to put plants in more water stress. When we talk about water then too, the patterns are a little bit more ambiguous. We're seeing some areas where precipitation is supposed to increase and some areas where it's supposed to decrease. Again, this is going to have direct impacts on plants. Where I work in Western North Carolina, what we've seen in the Southeast in general is that we haven't seen an increase or decrease in precipitation, but we've seen an increase in the variability. So the wettest of years we're seeing are getting wetter, the driest of years are getting drier. This is consistent with a lot of the climate predictions. And so again, this makes potentially too much water in some years and not enough water in other years. So these are some of the kind of key factors that we're trying to figure out how plants are going to respond, which plants are going to do better and worse, and then ultimately really looking for sustainable predictions that we can have to not only predict what plants are going to do, but look for different types of management or planting that can occur that might help to create more resilient forest ecosystems. I've probably gone over my time, but the thing that gives me hope, one of the things that gives me hope, are that there's an incredibly devoted and talented group of people that are working on the science side of things, looking at interdisciplinary aspects of this and really thinking holistically about how we can address these challenges. So I'll pass it off to the next panelist, and I'm looking forward to some questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. That is really helpful. It's great to know that inside the government and outside in the private sector, we have lots of people working on this problem, and it definitely makes me hopeful too. So we're going to move into a really quick question and answer session just with Matt and Chris. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so everybody can see all of you in big time. The first question I have is for both Matt and Chris, so maybe if you both don't mind answering one at a time. This is coming in from an attendee. I've heard that intact forests are better at sequestering carbon than fragmented forests. Is this correct, and why?
I'm going to let Chris answer that. I think Chris knows more about the inner workings of forests than I do at the sort of the physiological level.
Yeah, I'll put on my scientific answer, and we'll say it depends. I think, but I think in general, the more leaf area, basically the more biomass you have, the more trees you have, they're likely to be more productive. So fragmented forests are probably having the spaces in between that are not forested and are a different type of land use. So that can cause some challenges with basically kind of having areas where you're sequestering less carbon. I think the fragmentation does have a lot of impacts on I guess connectivity. I think another element that we're concerned about is connectivity in terms of hydrologic connectivity. So if you're fragmenting forests, separating them, water moves once it's in the soil, and if you've eliminated the pathway for water to get either move downslope or move into other areas, it can create new sources of water stress. And I think we can see that with fragmentation sometimes.
Cool. Thank you, Chris. I think this next question, it's just for you, but I think it relates a little bit to what you were just talking about. Is it transpiration in the leaves that pulls the water up from the ground?
Yeah, so transpiration is the process of the water vapor leaving at the leaf level. And so it's that suction, basically the water is moving from the place where it has the lowest potential. Its potential energy is it's moving from the soil matrix to places where it's kind of each location is a little bit drier. If you can think about putting a paper towel or a piece of cloth into a glass of water, the water is moving up with that tension, and then basically as it evaporates off the top, it's sort of wicking the water. So this process is the process is pulling the water up, and basically as the trees get taller, they can't just do it passively. They need to actually have a continuous water column that's like a straw that's able to pull the water from the soil up to the leaves. And ultimately, when that water leaves the plant, it goes up in the atmosphere. And like the figure that Matt showed, you can actually see it in these in these neat things at a daily level, these kind of clouds emerging when that water vapor is driven by largely by the transpiration leaving the leaves.
Very cool. Thank you for that explanation, Chris. Okay, Matt, this next question's for you.
Okay.
From an attendee. I live in the Sonoran Desert. Flora and fauna here are adapted to very high temperature. I wonder if climate change would positively affect this ecosystem, since the rising temperatures could mean the expansion of this ecosystem.
I think that's an interesting question, and I think yes, if the range expansion of that ecosystem, if it got hot and it enabled that ecosystem to expand to a larger area, I think that would be beneficial to that ecosystem and the creatures that live in it. I think there's an upper limit of that. I mean, there have to be an upper limit, and I don't know a lot about the upper limits of heat tolerance of cacti and other desert plants, but there's certainly an upper limit of the heat that they can tolerate, and absolutely for animals in those ecosystems as well. So I think yes, that probably or maybe true to a certain level, and I think that it past a certain temperature rise would no longer be true. And I don't know enough about the Sonoran ecosystem to know that if there's a buffer of 1 degree that the suite of species could tolerate, or if it's a bigger buffer than that.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Okay, we have one more question for Chris. Chris, how sensitive are trees to drier, dry years and wetter, wet years? Are they adapted for such variation?
They are to a certain extent. And there's been, have been dry years before. There's been droughts before. That's what both climate people that are concerned about climate change and people that are in denial about climate change will say that we've had these conditions, some of these conditions before. But I think we have a sort of an unprecedented combination of conditions that we're experiencing, both with increasing temperatures, like was mentioned, and changing in the variability of precipitation. And that's also mapped on top of a lot of other global change factors like invasive species. There are new introduced invasive species that can attack plants in different ways, different types of management, different histories of management. And they're all factoring together to kind of create these new systems. So yes, plants, a lot of plants are very well adapted to certain levels of drought, but we are also trying to determine, and we're sort of working at this as we go by, when you have more frequent droughts, with also associated with higher temperatures and also some sort of legacy of disturbance, how vulnerable are the systems going to be then? How vulnerable are individual trees going to be then? And so there, to a certain extent, there is quite a bit of adaptability in individual trees and in some ecosystems. But I think there's an open question that a lot of us are looking at as to what that tipping point is, or what the threshold is, when you start to combine interactions of factors of climate change.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate that explanation. Great. We are going to move back into the webinar. We'll have a chance for more Q&A at the end of the webinar. I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Thanks so much, Matt and Chris, again, for your explanation about forests and how they relate to climate. The next section of our webinar is a wildlife and biodiversity discussion with Laura Abondano and Jordan Karubian. Up first is Laura. She's a visiting professor and primatologist at Miami University in Ohio. Laura, please share a brief explanation of your work and what gives you hope.
Thank you, Laura. So yeah, as you mentioned, I've been working with primates, like this beautiful one that we have in the screen, for a little bit over 10 years now. I grew up in Colombia. I had the immense privilege of growing up in one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. And it was just just in my undergrad, being able to just visit these places was absolutely amazing, and what drove me into kind of working in this field. Then I've also worked in Ecuador and Peru, mostly focused on primates. So I worked with spider monkeys, which a lot of people are familiar with, right? The ones that hang off their tail and do kind of all these crazy movements. And these are kind of their cousin relatives, the woolly monkeys, that I just call them. They're the little gorillas of South America, right? They're all these fluffy, woolly, cute, adorable primates, also hang off their tail and move through the forest. But when you think about these animals, they require these healthy forests to be able to thrive, right? They need to move in these at the canopy level. They weigh around 7 to 8 kilos, right? So they need these strong structures to be able to move and survive in these forests. So what we've been doing is just kind of I study their behavior. In particular, I study their reproductive patterns. So when are they mating with each other? What are their physiological kind of adaptations to be able to reproduce? And something that is interesting, and some of the questions that have arisen over the last few years, is what's going to happen as we continue to see these global trends in warming temperatures, right? What we're seeing is that a lot of these primates, and if we can go to the next slide, some of these primates live in this magnificent forest, right? From the lowland Amazon to higher up in the Andes. So what might be happening, and if we can move to the next slide, as we see here in the figure, kind of in the lower right, that's kind of the distribution of these different primates in South America. And they were thought to be different species. Now they're classified as subspecies, but what's interesting here is that you don't see quite of a division or kind of like a separation between these, but instead you see kind of like this big overlap to some extent, right? Actually, where I've been working more recently in Peru is this beautiful place that we can see kind of here, an aerial view on the left, where basically where the Amazon meets the Andes. So where that little purple house is kind of our field site, where basically you see this kind of like altitudinal gradient, where you start kind of like in the lower area around 900 meters above sea level, but then you can go up to 4,600 meters. That is an incredible place to kind of like study these species, because what might be happening as we start seeing these warming temperatures is that maybe both at the vegetation level and the species level, you know, animals and species are going to start trying to follow those areas where their bodies are adapted to live, kind of like a little bit speaking to what Mark was saying a little bit ago. Some species have some sort of temperature threshold, right? And their bodies are adapted to live in certain conditions. And sure, they can adapt to new environments, but sometimes these changes are happening so fast. So the question is, are these animals going to be able to adapt to shift into these new environments? What we're seeing too is that when you have primates living in these highland elevations, there gets to a point where they cannot keep going up. The vegetation start becoming smaller and smaller, kind of like more shrubbier, right? And when you have this large primate species that is moving in areas where the vegetation can no longer support it, what's going to happen? What's going to happen when the individuals in the lower areas start kind of like moving up in the elevation gradient, right? And then you start seeing more competition between different species, between different groups. So something that is interesting to think about this too is when we think about these large primates, these are what we call the gardeners of the forest, right? They're the main seed dispersers of a lot of different plants, right? They're one of the few species that can, for example, like I always tell my students in class, right? If you're eating a large fruit with a large seed, that seed has to go through, and to be dispersed, it needs to come out to the other way. But if you're a small individual, you cannot do that. So you need these large primates to be able to disperse larger seeds in the forest. So the question is like, what's going to happen as we start seeing the shifts in these primate species over time? What's going to happen to the vegetation? What are these forest dynamics going to look like over time? So basically my research is looking at how are these individuals going to be able to adapt? Something that we see in these woolly monkeys from our studies in Ecuador is that kind of like their reproductive patterns kind of like follow along some changes in vegetation that we see over time, right? Around the same time of year, the same fruits start fruiting. So what's happening? The same trees start fruiting. So what's going to happen when these changes in kind of what we call phenological patterns also continue to change? How are animals, how are primates and other species going to respond to that? And that's kind of like my research in a nutshell. With primates is another complexity to this is that, for example, with woolly monkeys, females only have their first kid when they're around 6 to 8 years of age, and they only have one offspring every 3.5 years. So when you think about these populations, the adaptive capacity is kind of like reduced just because of their long lifespans, right? It takes a lot for these animals to reproduce. So to be able to adapt to these changes, it's going to be much more challenging for these individuals. So that's kind of like, again, what I'm trying to look at is kind of like, we need these long-term studies, right, where we can follow these species for multiple years to be able to see how some of these adaptations are being passed on or not from one generation to the next. And when you ask me what brings me hope, and maybe we can go to the next slide, as it has already been said, it's the people, right? It's the people that are living in these places, it's the people that are working towards these places, organizations like nature and culture that are really working together with people, right? It's nothing new, but I feel like what gives me hope, at least as a younger scientist, is seeing kind of like an opening in perspective that it's no longer working at a field site and working for those people, but it's working with the people, and it's working with everyone for everyone, right? We are, as we were seeing in kind of like the animation that Mark was showing at the beginning, we are connected one way or another, no matter where we are, right? So we need to work together, and seeing scientists working more with communities, as we're seeing scientists opening up their minds into, like recognizing the value of ancestral knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, right? And that we need to embrace that knowledge too, thinking about the co-creation of knowledge between scientists and local communities, seeing local communities as our collaborators and jointly working together. That is what gives me hope, that it's no longer the small group of scientists that are trying to solve the world, but it's really the integration of all of us working together. And I think there has been kind of a mind shift over the last few years, over the last few decades, that has opened up kind of like this idea that we need to be working together for that, and just seeing kind of like these communities being so excited about like becoming scientists themselves. That's what brings me hope, and I think that's kind of like where we should be moving forward. And with that, I'll turn it to Jordan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. That was a beautiful way of putting it. Your research is fascinating, and yes, I completely agree that the community effort is what really that's going to be the long-term sustainer. And yes, our next panelist is Jordan Karubian. Jordan is an environmental ecologist with Tulane University. Jordan, would you please share a little explanation on your research and your work with us, and as well as what gives you hope?
I would be happy to. Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules to join this. It's been fascinating so far, and I only hope I can keep up the good content here. So my particular area of focus is the Choco Biogeographic Zone, where after I completed my PhD research, which was really fascinating, but also really sort of ivory towery in terms of not really having a lot of direct conservation applications, I ended up moving to this part of the world, particularly in Northwest Ecuador. And I lived there full time for about 6 years, really embedded in communities in the province of Esmeraldas in Northwest Ecuador that are really on the front lines of expanding agricultural frontiers and forest loss. So if we can go to the next slide, we can see an image here of how in a 50-year period, the forest, which is shown in the stippled areas here in Northwest Ecuador, was just absolutely decimated. And unfortunately, this trend continues through to the current day with really high reforestation, with really high deforestation rates and very low rates of reforestation. So that there's estimates that less than 5% of the original Choco forests are still standing in Northwest Ecuador. And during my time living in Ecuador, sort of to Laura's point and those of other people too, I was able to, fortunately develop strong relationships with local residents that lived in this area that really ended up becoming an anchor and guiding the direction of what my future career looked like in terms of conservation work. So if we can go to the next slide, this area, it's interesting because it really houses incredible biodiversity. And I thought I would just put a few sort of gratuitous pictures in. Here's the long-wattled umbrella bird shown right here, an endangered and endemic species. And you can just kind of move through these if you want to. I'll talk briefly about each. The banded ground cuckoo, which is one of its closest relatives, is actually the roadrunner that many of us here in the United States are familiar with. It's a flightless bird that runs around rainforests all day, an endangered species. Here's the Ecuadorian capuchin monkey, a critically endangered species of primate, which is restricted to a few fragments of forest in this area. Next one. Blomber's tree boa, a species found only in a few localities in Colombia and in Ecuador. And the next one is the mache glass frog, which is a really amazing species of these glass frogs that are sort of translucent. So I hope you appreciated seeing just a small taste of some of the incredible biodiversity that's found in this area. And so together with local residents who live in this area, we founded an organization called FCAT, which stands for Fundación para la Conservación de los Andes Tropicales, or the Foundation for the Conservation of the Tropical Andes region, which is sort of the broad biogeographical area where this work takes place. And FCAT has gone on to create a reserve, and which is outlined in gold here. And it employs about 36 local residents right now, providing alternatives to deforestation. And one of FCAT's major goals is to create a continuous habitat corridor that links the Bilsa Reserve, shown on the left here, which is a 3,500 hectare area of forest. It's really one of the biggest chunks of forest left in this part of the world, through to Laguna de Cube, which is a unique and really fascinating freshwater lake that's found in this area. And Matt, in his comments, spoke a little bit about the importance of tropical forests for climate change. One statistic that I found particularly evocative is that that tropical deforestation is the third largest contributor to global climate change. If it were a country, it would be the third largest contributor to climate change or global warming after the United States and China. So, every effort that we can make to conserve standing forest is important. But when you get to an area like Northwest Ecuador and many other parts of the world where very little forest is left, then there becomes a real focus left on restoration of forest. And in particular for FCAT, to achieve this corridor, there's going to have to be pretty significant restoration efforts of pasture lands and agricultural areas to accelerate, the recovery process and provide connectivity and get these forests back to a state where they're contributing not just to biodiversity conservation, but also to global climate patterns. So if you can go to the next slide, please. The approach that we're using for this is something that I'm pretty excited about, and I just wanted to take a minute to talk about it with people. And this is the last slide that I'm going to be presenting on, but I do want to unpack it a bit. So when you think about restoration efforts, first of all, I think it's worthwhile saying that there's been a lot of press about restoration and tree planting, and billions of dollars are allocated to that really every year. But unfortunately, many of these efforts of reforestation and restoration fall short of the goals that those people who are implementing them set forth. And there's a few different reasons why that is. And I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but I do want to just highlight a couple. One is that there's really a lack of rigorous evaluation of what works and what doesn't work in terms of restoration efforts. And also, oftentimes, restoration efforts are designed by people who sit around in air-conditioned offices in places like Geneva or Washington, D.C., and decide what's going to work best for people in places like Ecuador or Indonesia and other places. And, those are two, I think, major reasons why some of these efforts haven't met the goals of the same people who designed them. So with FCAT and working with, leaders in tropical restoration, we've taken an approach where we hope to kind of flip the script a little bit on that. And what we're doing is sort of a three-phase approach to this. The first phase is a landscape scale experiment of what works ecologically. And to do that, we have a series of replicated treatments where we're varying the composition of tree species that we're planting, and we're also varying the spatial arrangement of those tree species. And we're also playing around with species, sort of short-term, economically valuable species of timber, as well as, high diversity mixes of tropical hardwoods, to try to answer that question of what are the most where do you get the most bang for your buck in terms of optimizing reforestation outcomes. And this work really does rely on biodiversity, in particular, following up on Laura's comments on seed dispersal agents, because it relies on planting out small islands of trees. And in those islands of trees, in addition to the target species that you want to grow, also planting out fast-growing pioneer species that produce fruits that induce seed dispersal agents like toucans to enter into those islands or those isolated patches of trees to feed on the fruits. And in doing so, they bring seeds from surrounding forest areas and accelerate the process of restoration. So we have a landscape scale experiment up that's running on that. It currently occupies about 25 hectares, and we're replicating it in another area right now fully. And in addition to that, we are just getting ready to start with a series of sociological surveys where we actually go to local residents and stakeholders and ask them, what would it take for you to reforest on your own private land? Are there incentives that are necessary? Where would you want to do it? What sort of trees would you want to use? What utility would those trees need to have for you? And then our plan is 3 or 4 years down the road from now to combine those two types of information to actually design and roll out what would be a regional project of restoration. And that's one of the major projects of FCAT right now that we hope is going to have a long-lasting impact. And so in terms of answering the question about what gives hope, I think that, my answer is actually going to be very similar to the ones that we've heard before about, seeing a real trend that there's youths and local residents and indigenous groups who oftentimes, their voices haven't been heard, even among those who have been planning out conservation efforts. And I think that there's a trend towards, greater agency and self-advocacy and among those groups. And I think it's also true that there's an awareness of people who are controlling the flow of dollars that business as usual really hasn't been working that well. So I think that there hopefully is going to be a nice confluence of a greater tendency to actually listen to voices that maybe haven't been heard that much in the past, and then also increased capacity and an increased sense of agency among those voices to really sort of foment a more grassroots movement towards conservation of tropical forests and slowing of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I couldn't agree more. And I'm also hopeful that money and decisions are moving in that direction. We are going to move into question and answer with Laura and Jordan right now. We still have one more panelist after this, so hopefully people will be able to stay over a little bit longer in the after we get through this next Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing the webinar. And our first question is for Laura. Can you talk more specifically about the ways that the woolly monkey's reproductive behaviors change in response to climate change?
Oof, that's an interesting question that I would love to answer, but as I mentioned, there's two tricky parts to this. One is what I already mentioned, that because of their long lifespans, this requires, I've been working with woolly monkeys for 10 years, and I was able to get kind of 3 cycles of kind of offspring, right? Which makes it really hard. And there's literally a handful of researchers that have been working with woolly monkeys, let alone with the woolly monkey reproductive behaviors. So the data is very limited. That being said, we know that they have some sort of adaptive capacity, or at least that their reproduction is changing based on some climatic variables, right? We have this instance, we were doing kind of this study of woolly monkey reproductive patterns to see kind of how it birthings and matings changed over the years. And something that we noticed is that, usually there was around the same number of individuals that were born every year. And then there was this year after El Nino year where there had been a lot of rain. Actually, the fruit production was very high in the forest. And then the births the next year kind of like doubled, right? So we know that, like maybe fruit production is having some sort of influence in the reproductive patterns. What we're seeing this year, right, is the Amazon is going, and you have probably seen over the news already, the Amazon is going through one of the most critical droughts that we're seeing. So it's all, when we think about this, we need to think about it as a system, right? How is that drought affecting the vegetation patterns, right? How is that affecting the fruiting patterns? And eventually, how is that going to influence the woolly monkeys' behaviors, feeding behaviors, right? And then how are those feeding behaviors going to influence the reproductive capacity? If, like it happens with us with humans, right? If we don't have the enough energy, it's going to be harder for people to kind of like make a baby, right? So it's similar with woolly monkeys. If there's a huge drought, right, and then they don't get enough food from the forest, we might see those reproductive patterns shifting, having a fewer amount of babies, and that eventually starts trickling down over the years, right, in terms of how viable or how sustainable is going to be that population. So my short answer is they do respond to these changes in weather patterns or in climate patterns, right? Right now, it's hard for me to kind of like tell you exactly how they're responding to it, just because we need such long-term studies. But that's our hope, right? Is to continue working with these populations, look at them in the long term, and be able to eventually be able to model what might happen in the future if we continue seeing these trends, and have more specific answers for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Okay, this next question is for both Laura and Jordan. Does wildlife play a role in carbon sequestration? Maybe Jordan, do you want to take it first and then?
Yeah, I'll take a quick crack at that. I definitely think it does, and in a variety of ways. But one way that I can just highlight is something that Laura has already mentioned, and I mentioned briefly as well, which is that many plant species rely on animals to disperse their seeds, which is a critical step in the reproductive cycle of plants. Without effective seed dispersal, the maintenance of tropical forests at least would really sort of fall apart. I think it's been estimated that above 80% of the tree species in most tropical forests depend on animals to disperse their seeds. So if you lose the seed dispersal agents, then you lose, over time at least, you lose the tree species, which play a crucial role in carbon sequestration. So I think that's one way in which animals really play a crucial role in sequestering carbon indirectly.
And to tag along on that a little bit, when we think about seed dispersers, is also understanding the idea of the diversity of seed dispersers, right? Because like as Jordan was saying, you have like these pioneer species that are kind of like dispersed by particular birds or particular species. So it's really thinking about that community and the diversity of seed dispersers that is going to be able to kind of like sustain the kind of like the variety of plants that eventually are going to sequester that carbon, right, and store it. So it sometimes we think more in terms of abundance than diversity, but diversity plays a key role in this too.
Thank you so much, Laura and Jordan. So we have some more questions that have come in, but we want to make sure that we get to our next and final panelist, Bob. So we're going to save the rest of the questions till the end. Some of our panelists might have to leave, but hopefully the attendees can stick around and listen to the rest of the presentation. So I'm going to get back to the PowerPoint presentation. And our next panelist is Bob Keefe. We're moving into the climate policy portion of the evening. Bob is our newest board member at Nature and Culture International. He leads E2, which is a national nonpartisan group of business leaders committed to policies that are good for both the economy and the environment. Bob, what are some ways that you're seeing a change in policy based on climate change, and what gives you hope?
Thanks, Laura. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can hear you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, look, I love being the last guy in the lineup after such a stellar group of speakers. I wish we were in person for a lot of reasons, but mainly so I could lead in applause for that fantastic work that everybody's doing. And I'm going to warn everybody up front that I don't have the exciting slides of woolly monkeys or translucent frogs. But I do get to talk about the most exciting thing that I know everybody wants to talk about, which is the wonderful world of policy. But it's not as boring as you think. And it's not as boring as you think because there's a lot of great stuff going on. Again, I was honored to join the board of NCI earlier this year because of the fantastic work that Matt, Laura, and everybody on the team is doing, but also because it's at the core and the center of what I think of as two halves of solving the climate crisis and reducing carbon emissions, or addressing carbon emissions rather. And as Laura mentioned, my day job is as executive director of E2, which is a national organization of business leaders who make the economic case for reducing carbon emissions. So we have the reduction of carbon emissions that we need, and then we have the sequestration and of the carbon that's out there. That's where NCI and others sit so centered on to address that part of the puzzle. And I have to tell you, folks, between knowing the great work that NCI is doing and knowing what's happening here in the United States, I have to tell you that I am hopeful. I am hopeful and more optimistic than I've ever been. And I say that because finally, the world's biggest economy, the most influential country on the planet, is moving in the right direction on climate. And it's doing it with haste suddenly, which is fantastic. So 2 years ago yesterday, actually, Congress passed, or President Biden signed into law, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which included about $80 billion in clean energy related initiatives, billions more in electric vehicle initiatives, charging stations, electric school buses, things like that. And then if that wasn't enough, 15 months ago, Congress passed and President Biden signed into law the most important climate policy really in the history of the planet. And we all know, have probably heard about that, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think it's a misnomer just to call it the most important climate policy in the history of the planet, because I think it's also one of the most important economic policies in our country, at least in recent generations. The IRA includes $370 billion more in tax credits and grants and other investments into climate and clean energy initiatives to really bring this country into the game when it comes to a global approach to clean energy and climate action for the first in a place that we should have been a long time ago. But finally, as I mentioned, we're getting there. So what we know is that those two policies, and primarily the IRA, are spurring an economic and environmental transformation in America like we've never seen before. My organization has been tracking clean energy jobs, clean energy projects that have been announced really over the past decade or so, but most recently around the IRA. And Laura, if you could change that slide for me. Since the IRA was signed into law, we've seen 250 plus major clean energy projects. These are EV factories, battery factories, solar panel factories. And now we're starting to see hydrogen operations and other clean fuels operations. This has been spread over 40 states. It's led to about $108 billion in private sector investment. That's from companies and investors. That's on top of what we were talking about, government tax credits and so forth. And these projects were announced with more than 90,000 jobs already that are in the works. And what's really interesting to me is where this is happening. This isn't just California and New York anymore. I literally this morning got off a plane from Georgia, which is leading the country in clean energy projects right now. Georgia, of all places. We have the biggest solar panel factory in the Western Hemisphere being built in the district of Marjorie Taylor Greene. We have the Republican governor of Georgia now saying that he wants his state to be the EV capital of the country. Next slide, if you would, please, Laura. You can just see a little bit where this is going. Clean vehicles leading the way, of course. Solar is huge, but these other areas are going to continue to grow. And then next slide, just again, I wish I had some monkeys and birds to show off instead of this lousy map. But you can see that these projects are concentrated in parts of the country that you wouldn't think would be leading the nation on climate. So what does all this mean? Obviously, it means jobs and investments and all that, but what the heck does it mean to the climate and saving those beautiful animals and the trees and everything else we've been talking about tonight? Well, if these policies play out like they're planned, it's going to reduce U.S. carbon emissions by about 40% by the year 2030. That's not enough. We need to do better than that. The good news is, and I can tell you as somebody who spent 20 plus years as a journalist, a lot of that as a technology journalist, once this stuff gets rolling, it's going to continue to grow even faster than we're talking about. Innovation is not factored in to the future growth of this, but when you factor those things in, I feel pretty confident we're going to come close to reaching our national goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. The other thing that's happening because of this is that, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, it's changing the dialogue around climate change. There are some people who could care less about woolly monkeys and translucent frogs and polar bears and ice caps and rainforests. They do care about jobs. They do care about investments that are coming into their states. And like it or not, when those types of things start to hit home, they start to think differently about climate. They start to think differently about clean energy. And so I truly believe that the economic case for climate action and the economic benefits that we're starting to see because of these purely climate policies are going to begin to change the dialogue around climate in America specifically, which is a fantastic thing if that happens. The other thing is that these policies that the United States passed had the effect of pushing other countries to follow. The United States leads whenever quite often, rather, and it needs to lead more. But really, after these policies were passed 2 years ago with the bipartisan infrastructure law and 15 months ago with the IRA, we started to see other countries jump ahead and pass their own policies, frankly, to try to keep up with what is expected to be a $27 trillion global market for clean energy. You had the European Union pass a huge package of policies to expand clean energy. Canada, Australia, Japan, China, etc. So this is what gives me hope. that we're moving in the right direction, not just in the United States, but we're finally doing our job as a world leader and pulling other countries along as well. So that's the half of the puzzle. The other half is the great and important work that NCI and other organizations are doing to save the places that are sequestering the carbon that we are producing. And that is one of the primary reasons that I wanted to be a very small part of such a fantastic organization like NCI. And one of the reasons why I hope many of you on this webinar will continue to support NCI and the great work that we're doing here. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Bob. We're thrilled to have you on board and on the board. And thank you for sharing all of that exciting policy related work. Who knew policy could be exciting, but you made it exciting. So we're grateful for that. We have a specific question for Bob, and then I believe we'll move into the main portion of the Q&A for the evening. So Bob, a question for you. What consumption behaviors should developed country individuals adopt to reduce climate change, and how can we best support developing nations?
Well, that's a great question. And as many of you know, I think beginning this week is the COP that's happening in Dubai, where one of the biggest issues is helping underdeveloped nations really figure out how to exist with the problems that the United States and other countries have created for this entire planet. So it's very imperative that we figure out how to get the resources and the funding to developing countries to not make the mistakes that we did, and to figure out climate adaptation so they can continue to survive.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, this next question is for Matt. Matt, has the change of leadership in Brazil had an appreciable impact on the destruction of the rainforests in Brazil?
Yes. There actually in the last couple of weeks been several articles. New York Times had an article about actually it's a 5-year low in the deforestation rate in Brazil, which roughly corresponds 5 years ago was near the beginning of Jair Bolsonaro's term. So Lula, who's the new president in Brazil, seems to be turning around the deforestation, reducing and not just Lula, but his ministers. He has a very powerful, charismatic environmental minister, and I'm forgetting her name, but effective in reducing the deforestation rate. And I think that is increased surveillance. They're increasing fines again. So increased enforcement against actors who are deforesting, and that seems to be having an effect. The other thing that Lula is doing as policy is increasing recognition for indigenous. So two indigenous nationalities indigenous lands were recently demarcated by the Lula government. And one of the things that very robust correlation between strong land tenure rights for indigenous peoples and lower rates of deforestation within those lands. So I think that's another positive policy movement that probably is having an effect on deforestation in Brazil.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, this next question is for Bob. Bob, what are the most pressing challenges in the implementation of climate-related policies for wildlife and forests, and how can they be overcome?
For wildlife and forest, I probably turn to Matt or someone else for that specifically, because they might have a better understanding of that than me.
Could you repeat the question again? I'm sorry, I heard Bob and I started spacing out for a second. What was the question?
Let me repeat it. What are the most pressing challenges in the implementation of climate-related policies for wildlife and forests, and how can they be overcome?
In terms of, I don't know much about United States forest policy. I mean, in terms of Latin American forest policy, I think that there are certainly economic drivers, which are, they're not, that's not a policy, but I mean, there are strong economic drivers that drive deforestation in Latin American countries. There is a lot of Latin American governments are dependent on revenues from extractive activities and deforestation to fill, to meet their budgets and do things that they want to do for their citizens that their citizens deserve. So, a lot of healthcare and construction of new roads and education that's funded in Latin American countries by activities that cut down the rainforest or mining or oil exploitation. So I think there's a tension between the desire to keep forest standing and the economic necessities that are driving these countries. So that's not like the policy per se, but I think that's one of the structural issues at play here that is a really sticky structural problem to overcome.
Well, Matt, I think we could probably say something similar about what's happening in the United States and in states like yours that depend on forestry as part of its as a very large part of its economy, and the timber industry as well. I think the good news is that people are realizing the importance of saving these forests and these trees like they perhaps haven't before. I saw a stat not too long ago that since essentially mankind came on the scene, we've cut down about 45% of all of the trees that were on this planet. That's unsustainable, obviously, and we're starting to see better forestry practices, I think, and we're starting to just have a better understanding of the importance of forests, not just because they're wildlife habitats and great places that we all need, but also because of the climate implications and their ability to sequester carbon.
And if I may add a little bit to that, when it comes to many Latin American countries, like as you've already said, like a big part of it is this political instability, right? A lot of times is not necessarily just the governments trying to provide these jobs for people, but it's actually the lack of jobs and the lack of opportunities that are pushing a lot of people to work in these kind of like more informal areas, like illegal mining or illegal logging, because as you were saying, Matt, right, is like people have to eat and people have to make a living. And if the government is not providing opportunities, if you are living in an area where the only way you can feed your family is working for this extractive company, it's a matter of like kind of like finding these opportunities. And that's why it's kind of like what we kept bringing up is like highlighting the voices of what the community needs and not what people in Paris and Washington, D.C. feel, because the realities here in the U.S. are very, very different than the realities that we see in Latin America and in many other countries. And we might think that is one thing or another, but it's like not until we sit on the same table and we are having those conversations of what is it that you need that we can start kind of like thinking about these ideas of implementing some of these policies and creating those spaces for this to happen.
Thank you to all of you for that very comprehensive answer to this question. It was good to hear it from each of your perspectives. We have two more questions that we are going to ask. So anybody that can stick around, panelists and attendees, hopefully will be done in just a couple of minutes. This next question is for Matt, but I think that maybe Chris or some others might be able to answer it as well. And please try to keep your answers condensed. So Matt, do sky rivers from the Amazon hydrate arable lands in the bread baskets of the US and Canada?
So I knew this question was coming and I did a quick Google search. I think the answer is yes. And what makes me say that is I actually found a scientific article from about 10 years ago that suggested if the Amazon was completely deforested, which, it's not likely ever to be completely deforested, that would be a massive area to deforest, that would actually reduce rainfall in the breadbaskets of the United States, as well as in the Pacific Northwest, reduce snowpack in the Sierra Nevada, all over the United States. So yes, I think that is a true statement, that the Amazon actually makes it rain or influences rain in all over the world, including the heartland of the United States and Canada.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Okay, our last question is for both Matt and Bob. Are there offset opportunities for U.S. entities to help fund preservation and reforestation of these incredible forests?
Go ahead. You've done some work on this recently.
Yes. So in the Ecuadorian provinces that I was mentioning in my answer, where we have worked with indigenous and government stakeholders to create protected areas, we have created robust plans to reduce deforestation there, and those are being funded by climate funds, carbon funds, so from international entities from different countries, and from a coalition called the Leaf Coalition, which includes some of the biggest companies, corporations in the world, some of the biggest Fortune 500 corporations. In Ecuador, that climate funding, and this is getting a little bit into inside baseball, those are not offsets, so that the companies don't get an actual credit that offsets their emissions elsewhere. This is what would be called payment for performance, which is payment to reduce deforestation without getting the corresponding offset credit elsewhere. But that's a little bit inside baseball, like I was telling you. The basic answer is yes, there are opportunities to fund conservation efforts in all the places that we work.
Yeah, I would say that absolutely there are opportunities to do that. Frankly, there are also opportunities for greenwashing and flat out corruption sometimes. Offsets have gotten a bad name in recent years, and probably for good reason. Fortunately, there are organizations like Nature and Culture International and others that are helping to make offsets more legitimate, and they're trustworthy voices and trustworthy organizations that are helping to ensure that these offsets are doing what they're supposed to do in the way they're supposed to do it. So another reason we should be supporting NCI.
You're so great, Bob. I love how you keep coming back to that. It's wonderful. Like you're a ringer.
No, that's true.
Yeah, I absolutely. I'm not.
The work you're doing is fantastic.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I just love how you keep bringing it up, and I think that's wonderful.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much, and thank you to Chris as well for sticking around. Here, let me share the last bit of the presentation. Yes, thank you to everyone. Thank you to all of our panelists for sticking around. We do have a quick survey. If anybody can stay and quickly take the survey, we're going to launch an exit survey. Hopefully you can take a minute to fill that out. But we want to say thank you to all of our panelists, these amazing experts that have come together this afternoon/evening, depending on where you are in the world. Could be morning for some of you. Good morning to anybody out there tuning in a very different time zone. But thank you so much for catching this webinar with us and joining these amazing panelists. Like I mentioned earlier, if any of this was compelling to you, this discussion about deforestation, about habitat and species loss, about climate policy, please take a moment to support the work of Nature and Culture International. You can follow us on social media. All of our handles are here on the screen. You can subscribe to our e-news. And please, if you're feeling very compelled, take a moment to donate to our end of year campaign. As I mentioned, we are going to be sending out a recording of the webinar in a few days after we've edited it. In case you have any friends or family that weren't able to join us tonight, and they want to listen in to all the incredible stuff that our panelists had to share tonight. But otherwise, please get in touch with us at Nature and Culture if you have any questions. The contact for most of the panelists is in the chat as well, so you can scroll through if you need to get in touch with any of them. But we are very grateful to all of you for attending tonight. Thank you to our panelists again. Thanks so much, everybody, for taking the exit survey as well. We're thrilled to be in touch with you now, and we hope to stay in touch with you in the future. Thank you so much.